Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in this series, where we have been exploring the different recommendations for planning reform in our recently released paper, Strategic and Statutory Planning Review to Create Our Living River. Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? My name's Nerida Taylor, and I work for the Parramatta River delivery engine in Sydney Water. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters where we work, live and learn, and specifically the people of the Guruk Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land I am standing on. Their law, traditions and customs have nurtured and continued to nurture the waters, saltwater and sweetwater in the Parramatta River catchment, creating wellbeing for all. We recognise the importance of Aboriginal leadership in the management of the river, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, just a little meeting etiquette. This is a short 20-minute presentation with 10 minutes allocated for question time. Please use the Q&A function that you will find next to the chat function, and we'll attempt to moderate some questions so we can have a bit of a robust discussion at the end. The webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on the Our Living River website, and we'll put a link to it and send you a reminder where it's been uploaded. Now, as you can see from this slide, this has been a very collaborative piece of work, and I'd like to give a special thanks to our co-leads at DPI and especially our consulting partners from Seville Consulting and Macquarie Uni. So I'd like to formally welcome Alexa McCauley, Director at Civil Consulting, and Peter Davies, Senior Lecturer in Environmental Planning at Macquarie Uni, who will take you through the presentation.
Right, thanks very much. So there are three things that we want to go through today. The first is the why. Why do we need a new approach to development around our waterways and our riparian lands? And I guess building upon that, we'll ask this question as what are the issues and challenges to get around this problem? And that relates to the value proposition of those particular environments. And then finally, we're going to pose the question of what would a blue-green grid look like in terms of progressing or prosecuting that case for good riparian outcomes. So when we start to think about what do we know? So for a healthy living river, we need a network of good tributaries that are alive, that are clean water, that are green, that have this flowing capacity to support ecosystem function, but also to provide that social connection across the catchment. And when we start to think about waterways and riparian, it's embedded deeply within our land use planning system. They're embedded deeply within our engineering systems. Most of our sewer lines follow the riparian systems, and that follows this long tradition of thinking about our riparian areas as the easiest paths to get from point A to point B. And so within that, we can start to think about the social construction of riparian lands and how people can use those spaces, as well as the infrastructure and the ecological values that come with it. So some work that was done by Carl Tippler and a few others, including myself, a couple of years ago now, we started to think about what are the species that matter most to our Parramatta River catchment. And I guess in identifying the 5 iconic species that we had here, part of the exercise really turned on what do we need to support those iconic species? And it's essentially good habitat. And habitat that can provide food, shelter, migration pathways and so on. And so when we start to think about the value of riparian areas from an ecological perspective, you can think about the long-necked turtle, which is an interesting case in point. It doesn't necessarily need clean water, but it needs water. And so when we start to think about that from a riparian angle, it's around offline wetland systems that you could create to enable that habitat of that particular species. Whereas others, such as the striped marsh frog, are a little bit more sensitive to water quality. And so you can't throw away those aspects if you are to support that diverse and particularly these iconic species that the community said and have told us that they matter. So when we start to think about the construction of healthy ecosystems within a catchment, think about the construction of healthy ecosystems within a catchment. There are multiple parts, and I guess this is the complexities of the Parramatta River catchment. We've got the terrestrial environment, we've got our riparian environment, our freshwater, and our estuarine environments. And all of those play a fundamental role in how we can support good ecological outcomes. But moving beyond that, we need to think about how our waterways have a relationship to those terrestrial and riparian freshwater estuarine environments. And so we know historically we've used our waterways as conduits for efficient flow. And I guess with that, we've actually led to a lot of bank erosion rather than stabilisation. And with that, we've started to destroy many of those small micro-habitats that are needed. We also know that sort of robust, rough-looking edges around our riparian corridors are good and valuable for filtering pollutants, for doing our nutrient recycling. And then we can start to think about the flows within our catchments. So hydraulically efficient waterways are great for flood control, not so good for our ecology. And so we need to find this happy balance, this nice equilibrium in terms of minimising risk, but also enhancing building our riparian environments for ecology and also for people. And so that basically led to this notion of three main strategies. We have to protect and enhance what we have. We have to think about the overland flow paths to manage flood risk, but also think about that in terms of densifying that vegetation so the water's slow and so there's some complexity within those environments. And then we also need to think about stormwater treatment systems within and online across our riparian environments. So I guess this leads us to various New South Wales government policies, and this one is almost 10 years old now. And essentially it was constructed, the riparian corridor policy was constructed to think about how much land do we need to set aside to protect our riparian corridors. And prior to 2012, there was this generic 40-metre copper bank either side. And I guess what the government has tried to do is provide a bit more of a nuanced approach here, where your smaller streams, your category 1 Strala classified streams, can get away with 10 metres either side of bank, and your second order 20 metres, etc. So when we start to think about what that means is, historically we've had our development really close to our channels. We haven't had those good riparian systems in place, particularly across many parts of the Parramatta River catchment. And Alexa will give you some good examples as we go. But when we start to think about the hydroline, or those, mapping where our creeks are, a lot of that work has been done. But what we'll see is the fine detail is often missing. And so what is mapped as a first order Strala stream, some of those sort of little veins that are spreading across our catchment are probably not picked up. And so from a land use perspective, there are missed opportunities in terms of how do we position our riparian policies, our restoration policies, our strategic land acquisition studies. So when we start to think about typical approaches to riparian management, we've got setbacks, and what do setbacks look like in terms of different configurations? So here's an example of an unnamed tributary in Denniston, which is actually not mapped on the hydroline. But clearly we can see that dense vegetation. You can look at the lock configurations. So there's something happening there. And it actually needs a person to get out in the field to say, well, it's a bit wet. It looks like a creek, and it probably is a creek, and therefore we need to map it as a creek. And so from that, we can then pull back to say, well, what are our appropriate setbacks in terms of creating that habitat opportunity? We've got other examples in terms of Duck Creek, where you've got minimal riparian areas and restoration around the creek. And that's not to say that we can't do more, but we need to identify strategically where those lands are. And I guess what we also have quite significantly, and it's reflecting the long history of development across the Parramatta River is our creeks have been channelized primarily from that 1940s to 1960s view of engineering. So we just hydraulically make these waterways as efficient as we can. And so we construct these box channels, move water from A to B quite quickly. And that's really created these challenges in terms of how do you bring back some of the riparian areas. So we need to think about developing a new framework that addresses the natural waterways, that addresses degraded lands, and also addresses that third category of your channelized paths. And I'll just touch quickly on the natural waterways, and then Alexa will take over for the next. But I did some work with Sophia Finlay at Greenway Council many years ago, and what we started to think about in terms of the riparian lands was we needed to understand, firstly, where are the creeks? And this goes back to, you can look at the hydroline, but you also must get out in the field and map these particular environments, because there are going to be creeks and waterways that exist that local knowledge will tell you where they are, but an aerial photography might not give you that detail. But what we find different to Greenway is in the Parramatta River catchment, this is flat, relatively flat land. Most of our smaller creeks are located within existing developed areas. Whereas Greenway, the geomorphology or the shape of the land is quite different. Deep in size sandstone, and so we can't necessarily take up the approach that Greenway has done and apply it straight into the PRCG just because of different histories of development and different land uses. So when we start to think about what this might look like for our smaller waterways and our larger waterways, we need to protect our bed and bank. We need to improve water quality. But we'll also find different opportunities in terms of what we can do within our larger versus our smaller streams. So for our larger waterways, it's fundamentally thinking about them as environmental corridors, riparian corridors, habitats. Our smaller waterways, we're needing to think a little bit more closely around ensuring their geomorphic integrity over time. But most importantly, when we think about the Parramatta River itself, we're thinking about that wide corridor, a place for flora and fauna to move, but also a place for people to access the corridors.
All right, so the Greenway framework has kind of gotten us that far. It's a really good framework for those natural streams and those that we want to protect from further degradation. And it shows us how we might pick up the smaller streams that weren't mapped and make sure they're captured in our planning system. But of course, as Peter mentioned, in the Parramatta River catchment, there's a whole lot more degraded, piped and channelized waterways. And so Greenway's framework does deal with these degraded waterways to some extent, but the situation in Greenway and the inherent assumption in their framework is that those degraded waterways are really mostly first order streams at the top of the catchment where things have been piped. But of course, in the Parramatta River catchment, a lot of those degraded waterways are much bigger second and third order streams. So that's where the Greenway approach starts to be yet less useful to us. And we've started to look at different approaches we could use that build on that Greenway framework, but are useful for these Parramatta style streams. So if we have a look at what's been achieved elsewhere, I think there are some good clues to what we're trying to aim for here. So Sydney Olympic Park is a great example that's on our doorstep, where major redevelopment provided an opportunity to also drive ecological outcomes, and particularly around waterways and wetlands at Sydney Olympic Park. So, you know, former industrial area, which will be similar to lots of the development we see in the Parramatta River catchment over the coming decades. And they've managed to restore streams while also getting a lot of development into that area. an international example that has some similarities but works on a different scale. This is Tanner Springs Park, which you may have seen before in Portland. And this part of Portland has also been former industrial area that's being redeveloped as mixed-use development. And as part of that, they've found these opportunities like Tanner Springs Park to create new public open space, and in doing so, rediscover a stream, re-daylight a waterway that has previously disappeared. And we can imagine those kind of opportunities in the Parramatta River catchment. And a couple of examples that are not fully realised yet, but are well in the pipeline. The inner west Cooks to Cove Greenway is a really interesting one, where they have identified this opportunity for the Greenway a long time ago and done a lot of work in their planning system to make it happen. And so this image here shows a section of the Greenway where there is redevelopment taking place on former industrial land again, around the rail corridor. And what the councils have done here is, as each of those sites have redeveloped, they've made sure that the developers are required to put in easements for public access and to build, as part of their works, pathways, vegetation, and facilities to make that public access and environmental restoration work along the Greenway. And the picture there shows a mix of restoration in both the public and the private domain, but the boundaries start to blur between the two. Another example from the inner west is at a smaller scale. This is from a development application for a site at Rich Street in Marrickville, which is also former industrial land that's being redeveloped to mixed use. And what the developer has proposed is publicly accessible open space, privately owned public access. And you can see on the left of that image, there's a stormwater channel which actually cuts through there, and they've got the idea there to daylight that channel and make it a feature in the public domain. So you can imagine, like, if one site does that, it's interesting, but what if a whole lot of developers did that along that channel and created new links through? If we start to come back to the Parramatta River catchment, you know, we've got these areas like along Duck Creek and a Beckett's Creek here, where there will be those larger scale precincts that redevelop, and there's opportunities both to reimagine the riparian corridor along those larger creeks, but perhaps also reimagine some streams that have been completely lost in the surrounding development. Perhaps what's harder to imagine is what might happen along a stream like Pendle Creek, where it might not all be developed in such large precincts. And at the moment, it's really hard to imagine what happens when you've got all these individual private lots, a lot of which back onto the creek. If they all get redeveloped one at a time, it's very hard to ask any individual lot to make a big riparian area on their small property. But if that was a creek that you identified as a really important one to plan for, perhaps council planning system could encourage the kind of development where a group of lots are all redeveloped together, and they include riparian restoration as part of that larger site. And that's kind of what's happened along West Greenway in one other spot. They're looking at this section where there's individual residential properties which will all be developed together, and they're aiming for that kind of outcome where the development's set back further. Subiaco Creek, again, hard to imagine those larger precinct scale redevelopment opportunities, but it's a nice little example that has an example of this missing link in the waterway. You can see top right, some sections of the waterway that are still in somewhat natural form, and then a big gap before the waterway starts again downstream. And through that section that's been lost, you might never be able to fully restore the link through there. But perhaps a few strategic opportunities could open it up. And perhaps it could even be that it's just a strategic biodiversity corridor that you might not you might not have a lot of opportunity for waterway restoration, but you might have really good opportunities for revegetation and even creating those green grid links. So what we've set up in the recommendations paper is a suggested framework that covers those three categories of waterways: the natural ones, the degraded ones, and the piped and channelized ones. And our thinking is that it's if everyone can follow a similar framework, and it's not necessarily perfect at the moment, but you know, if everyone can thrash out a framework they can agree on, and there's a starting point there, and then it will take that local mapping to work out which objectives apply where, what kind of stream have we got here, and what objectives do we want to apply to it. And so we've suggested some objectives that might work for degraded waterways. So, and what we've suggested is that we need to think about what type of waterway is it. Has it got an open corridor with public open space along it? Or is it confined by private development? Or is the waterway actually fully located on private land, and then the opportunities might differ? So on all of those, you might have these chances for restoring some ecological function. But if you've got public space, then perhaps it becomes more about creating a more connected corridor. If it really is a bigger corridor of public open space, you might have more opportunities to recreate the riparian zone. If you're dealing with a lot of private land, then it's perhaps more opportunistic. And those degraded, those piped and channelized waterways, we've suggested just a simpler set of objectives that still aim for restoration of some ecological function where it works. It may be that some of them become more about the green grid links, the active transport links and public access rather than ecological restoration, where others ecological restoration makes more sense. Where there's public open space, reclaim what you can in terms of riparian vegetation and ecological function. And of course, the opportunities might be greater where there's more public open space. I'll hand back to Peter just to sum up. Can I read a couple of slides?
So essentially what we're trying to do here in terms of putting forward some ideas is not give a generic response. So every waterway has its own equal level of protection. And so for a good nuanced urban policy, what we're suggesting is that we consider the three different categories of streams within which there are different levels of control and objectives that sort of come out. And it is because of that nuance that we're probably going to get some better ecological, environmental, social outcomes. Because without that nuance, we end up with a very blunt instrument. And we know blunt instruments in a planning scheme are setting yourself up for failure. So when we start to think about our existing riparian networks that we have, what we're trying to do within these three categories is build on those networks, enhance them, but importantly, we needing to protect what we have. Because there are many situations when I was working in local government where somebody wants to subdivide their land. There might be a creek in their backyard, it's not mapped, and so therefore you lose the legitimacy or the planning legitimacy to say, no, the creek is a valuable asset. So we must get in first and actually identify what is there as a background data layer. And that can then trickle through to our development control plans, riparian policies. So when we're starting to think about natural waterways, degraded waterways and channelized waterways, we're needing to think critically about what are the objectives. Now, clearly, we're going to have different opportunities, as Alexa was pointing to. So we can have some examples where you can have large lot redevelopments that can create and provide that new habitat. But that's not always going to be the case. Your small lot incremental development within the catchment, Subiaco Creek as an example, where you're going to have to think about what are the setbacks, what are the landscaping provisions, deep soil provisions that you can build into the private space that also can provide some public benefit. So when we're starting to think about those three categories, you know, your natural waterway is your fundamental good environmental corridor. It provides that habitat function first and foremost. But we also know these areas have a lot of opportunity for social connections. And then we start to go through those different waterway classifications going down to the degraded and piped. Less opportunity, but different opportunities. The next steps. Really, you've got to do some mapping.
Yeah. And we're sort of pursuing some funding so that we can get some matched funding for councils so that they can do that mapping themselves. And but I guess initially what we want to do is establish a working group. And again, I think I've put it in the email reminders and everything. Get in touch. We want to establish this working group. We want to set those waterway categories and objectives. We understand we need to map and really understand where our waterways are in the Parramatta River catchment so that we can then start applying this framework that's being developed. So that is our next step, is really to establish this working group at the moment. And I think there might be some questions. I can't see them, but I'm going to get my trusty assistant here.
There are some questions.
You want to help out, Nell?
Oh, yeah, I was going to go for it. Look, the first question's from Craig, and he's just talking about the stream water classification and gave some examples in Blacktown where, you know, they're classified as a first order stream, and then there's a section that then's classified as a second order, but they're the catchment sizes are really different. So he says, what are your thoughts on including catchment size into how we classify stream order and riparian protections, not just the hydroline? Ultimately, I think the hydroline is good for rural natural waterways, but not urban city landscapes. Your thoughts?
Craig, it's a great question. And I guess what we can't do is develop a whole new government policy on mapping waterways. And I say that because I tried when I was working at Greenway, and in that intervening period when we were developing our riparian policy, the classification system came through and said, this is the system that we use in New South Wales. The challenge, however, is in terms of the Strala classification is many of our first order streams have been piped and disappeared. And so what might have been a second order is now a first order because we don't know where our first order ones are. So this is one of those inherent problems.
I think Greenway showed us that hydroline mapping is a good starting point if you have if nothing else is mapped. Use that hydroline data. But what Greenway's done is they've done their own mapping for all their streams to work out what really needs to be classified and what the order should be. And that's let them apply more carefully what the riparian controls. Still using the same framework that's in the Water Act, but taking the mapping and developing it further. And that's taken them actually a few iterations. They didn't do it all in one go. They did it over several iterations.
And I'd also say when matters have gone to the New South Wales Land Environment Court, there's great comfort local government can have to say, we mapped our waterways in a consistent approach with the New South Wales government policy. And that will give you a great legal precedent and standing to uphold your riparian policy examples.
Great.
Okay.
Do we have any more questions, Nell?
Yep, there's two more. Oh, and a third's just come in. So Craig Norton from Canterbury Bankstown has asked, they've got a lot of concrete channels with development right up to the creek line. Oops, I've done that. Is this typology being considered for some of the management?
I guess that was one of the categories that we've been thinking about too, because that's common in the Parramatta River catchment, the piped and channelized waterways. What can you achieve there? And particularly if those waterway corridors are redeveloping, you know, how can you create a framework that looks to take advantage of redevelopment along those waterways?
And so there's opportunity for lateral thinking here. So often we have those pipe channelways, they move water quickly and then they essentially stay dry. And so you're missing out on some of the habitat or wet habitat opportunities. So you could think about retaining a bit more water in the landscape and having a bit more continuous flow, roughening up some of those channels to provide that diversity of habitat.
Or where you've got redevelopment that's not just an individual lot at a time. If it is happening in chunks, what can you ask of a bigger site that becomes possible?
Okay, also a question from Mike Healy on flooding. How would the framework incorporate flood management, including upstream and downstream implications?
Yeah, so flooding first and foremost is always your primary consideration. And that's a legal requirement under various acts. But what you're able to do is think about different habitat opportunities within that expanded riparian zone. So you're thinking about your overland flow paths, but your overland flow paths don't necessarily have to be hydraulically efficient. They can be roughed up a little bit so they can keep those water in the landscape and have that water quality improvement functions as well as a hydraulic flood mitigation.
Yeah, you might need to give them a little bit more space because you lose some of that efficiency. But if we can encourage those kind of combined outcomes, that's what we're thinking about.
Now another one's come in, but anyway, it's tricky setting objectives for waterways where longitudinally they change in status. For example, how do you see setting objectives where you have a first order degraded water flowing into a second order natural waterway?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and it demonstrates the complexities within urban catchments. And so you just need to accept that there are some opportunities that you can do with some streams that you cannot do with other streams. And that's not to say that you shouldn't aspire to do more. But if you have, these degraded waterways that's flowing into something of a better quality, you should be doing as much as you can do, but also being realistic. So there's no point having idealistic policy. It also needs to have a bit of pragmatism.
And I think this is where it needs a bit of local thinking. Like it's very hard to look at all the waterways across the Parramatta River catchment and say, well, all these need to meet these objectives and all those have a different set of objectives. It will need the local councils looking at their local waterways and sitting down together with the planners, the ecologists, the open space teams, all working together to work out what's the right set of objectives for each particular waterway. And it may differ along the corridor. It might be quite a complex outcome, but that local thinking is really important. And so our thinking is this is a framework which helps you all follow a consistent approach, but it totally needs that local application.
Yeah.
And so the mapping techniques like the rapid riparian assessment, which you can use to assess your environment against geomorphology, litter, flow, etc. From that particular assessment, you can start to think about, well, where do your streams, for example, might need more bed and bank stability, irrespective of other objectives, just in order to maintain that good water function. And that then becomes your priority in terms of interventions.
Okay, one more question. So for inner city councils where many of the waterways are channelized, I think you may have answered this a bit, do councils have any direct influence over naturalizing it?
I guess it's complex because there's some of those channels are owned by Sydney Water and they've naturalised some of them when the asset reaches the end of its life. They're not all Sydney Water owned, and councils might own some of them too. The land is under different ownership as well.
Yeah, so we did a couple of years ago. We looked at, I guess, some of the governance arrangements of some of our waterways in the Parramatta catchment, and there were examples where there were 5 or 6 different owners within essentially a stone's throw. Whether it was a transport agency, Sydney Water, councils, etc. So there's always that inherent complexity around who manages what, where, how. Is it narrowly defined? Is it riparian buffer defined? If you have a good, consistent policy framework, you can start then to think about what could you do in terms of the riparian area as much as the in-stream or in-channel location.
Yeah, and I guess knowing it's rarely that straightforward. It's often this indirect influence over a complex situation. That's when you need a strong policy framework.
Yeah.
But the examples that Alexa was speaking to around the imagination that you can actually create with daylighting streams, that's the main story that I think you could take home out of today, is there are opportunities, and don't just necessarily see the channel as a channel and therefore will always be a channel. You know, if you accept that as a position, you'll never go forward.
All right, well, that's the last question, guys. So it's 1:37.
Okay. We're running a little bit behind, but thanks so much everyone who attended the webinar, especially give my thanks to Alexa and Peter. So as I said, we are keen to progress the two frameworks that we discussed in detail in the paper and in these webinars. And if you'd like to be part of the development, please get in touch, and thanks again for attending. See ya.